Welcome everyone to CoSM's Art Church on the new moon. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, CoSM stands for Chapel of Sacred Mirrors, a radically welcoming interfaith art church where we celebrate art, creativity as a spiritual practice. And in doing that, at our church, we discover a subject that's relevant to art and spirituality. And that's what we're here to do today. And I'm so glad that we have Tyler James Berger with us and my beloved Alex.
Hey.
Thank you, Alex and Allyson, and welcome to everyone at home. Looking forward to exploring the subject of sacred geometry today. So let's start with, what is sacred geometry and why does it matter?
Well, as an artist, it's one of the ways of really understanding the harmonics of the body and of seeing and examining for their sacred content the primal shapes that we're surrounded by every day. And plus it's a really fun kind of meditation to do with a compass and straight edge and pencil that people at home can do themselves, you know. And so having these supplies nearby might be fun to play with.
Yeah, it's sacred geometry because we imbue it with sacred meaning to each number, you know, and they appear in nature. These different shapes and patterns appear in nature, so as a form constant.
Mm-hmm.
Well, certainly the circle. You've got the primal shape, number one, you know, and so we see it in the sun, the royal disc that the Egyptians celebrated there, and it's the earth, it's the eye, everything is kind of mandalic, you know, in our universe because of this, the circularity, I think, of the eye. And so our sacred kind of structures, our earliest kind of stone circles and things like that would directly relate to this sort of primal spiritual relationship that we have with this one-sided geometric shape, you know, of the circle. And
well, the circular interconnected circles, the 13, 12 around the outside and the one in the middle, is called the Flower of Life, which was seen in the Temple of Abydos on the wall there, embedded in the wall, and no one knows how old that is. It's so old.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Well, yeah, the ancients, the Egyptians and Greek culture and all the early civilizations, the Hindu culture, they each had a sacred geometric kind of matrix that would underlie both their temples and the temple art. The deities and all the drawings of Buddha and things like that, they were all done according to sacred proportion. And likewise, the Greeks and Egyptians had proportional guides regarding their figures that really understood sacred geometry in general.
And the Renaissance embraced sacred geometry. They, you know, the perfection of it, finding the perfection as part of the sacredness of geometry.
Yeah.
Well, the two-sided sacred geometric shape then would be the Vesica Piscis. And this is also the famous birthplace of, you could take every shape out of the Vesica, and that's why it's also an amazing kind of shape. We've got the two overlapping circles giving us the two-sided sacred geometric form, which is also resonant with the yoni and with the divine feminine, so it's identified also as a womb shape and a birthing kind of shape.
Yes, you'll see it in the entryway of Chartres Cathedral, where Christ is superimposed on this yoni shape. It's like male comes out of female, and it's a symbol of femininity, really.
Right, but you know, you can draw, so that's the two-sided sacred geometric form, the Vesica, but you can draw the triangle right inside of it. It's got an equilateral triangle just by connecting the middle kind of points and then up at the top.
You connect the two radiuses of the two circles that are overlapping. And from there you have the overlapping point.
Yeah, on the triangle. So there you've got the number 3 shape growing out of number 2. So number 3, of course, that's the Trinity, you know, and it can symbolize so many different things. But as this is I'd say the primary symbol of mind.
That's right.
And it's the primary symbol of flame.
Right.
See, so the upward pointing triangle is also identified with the male principle.
The male
you know,
principle, yes.
and so
the bottom is the earth. It's like, you know, if you're on the earth but you're pointing towards the heavens, that's spirituality. So triangle is associated with spirituality.
Exactly. So that's the yeah, and of course the pyramids. Of course, they knew what they were doing. You know,
pointing up.
Yeah.
It was like an antenna almost.
Right.
But then you have
the square.
4-sided.
You're the queen of
figure.
squares.
And to say that all sacred geometry exists in nature would really be it gets a little difficult with the square. There's really a very few times that the square appears in nature. One of them is in the eye of a lobster. If you look at it on a microscopic level, it is gridded. But most creatures' eyes are not gridded down to, you know, gridded in the 4-sided figure. So, but a square is a symbol of the earth, of the material world. When I chose the square in my work as a characteristic to my work, it was because I was articulating the essentiality of being an artist, which is a person who uses materials in the material world. Art exists in the material world. Art does not exist in the mind. It has to have evidence. Art is evidence and intention. The intention of the artist, but it has to have evidence too. You can't have art without evidence. So I was making that essentialized worldview of art as the square. And square works very nicely because it tessellates, it fits together, it's close packs very, very, very well. And the diamond. And if you put the point of the square on the midpoint of the square underneath it, and I've done that in my work, where I diamond over square, regressing in size. On the midpoints, very interesting things happen geometrically with that and mathematically, because, you know, every time you cover over something, you're cutting it directly in half.
Yeah.
And it's very interesting sacred geometry.
You've done a lot of paintings with that kind
I've
of
learned
square
a lot.
root, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, but then after the 4-sided figure, you have the 5-sided figure.
The pentagon, the pentagram. It's an easy thing to draw. You know, if you've got your vesica, you know how to draw that. But then if you draw a third circle on that comes from the one of the intersections of the vesica, like the bottom one, you can put your compass point on that, spin another circle, and now you've got 3 circles. Now you also want to draw a line vertically through the vesica. And when you do that, then you establish these different intersecting points. And by making a careful line with your ruler and lining it up, you can find the side of the pentagon and notch it in there. So the pentagon can come out there, and curiously enough, the hexagon is pretty easy to
Before we get to the
pull
hexagon,
forward.
though, I wanted to say that the pentagon is the 5-sided figure, but the pentagram, of course, is the star. The 5-pointed star is a symbol for humankind. They say man, but basically 2 legs, 2 arms, and a head. That is a symbol for man. Whereas the square is a symbol for building, basically. It's like you see it in buildings or civilization, you know, where they cordon off square acres and things like that. Where the pentagram is the male, or the figure.
Human. It's
Human,
like
not
a human,
male, really, but the figure.
it's also about regeneration. It's about life, because the star, if you just draw it, through the precise pentagram, it will contain the golden ratio inside of each line on your star. So the golden cut is inherent in this star, and that sets off a growth cycle.
So from the pentagram or the pentagon, you can derive the hexagon.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the hexagon is the six-sided figure. And what do you want to say about that?
It's the ultimate architecture of the universe, I'd say. The smartest things use the hexagon, because the bees, of course, make their homes out of hexagons, and they house their young there, and their food and everything is hexagonal. So it's also the way that carbon molecules pack together to make a diamond. Close packed lattices are as tight as you can get, and that is the way that nature nests and grows.
It is. It's a very strong construction. The hexagon.
It's amazing to see bees so naturally manifest this perfect form. It's not like they're consciously creating that. They're just kind of like riding this rhythm into its creation.
They don't need anybody to show them how. They're really amazing.
Well, the divine designer, this is why we call it sacred geometry. It's inherent in the nature field. We see it reflected in myriad forms.
It's a small community. It has a community symbolism to it, like the unity of community. It's like very tight and strong.
The hive mind.
But there are many cathedrals, and particularly I was thinking the Basilica of Santa Maria is, has a lot of architecture based on the pentagram and the hexagon, both of them. The hexagram is a six-sided star. So it is the Star of David, and it is the upward pointing triangle, the lingam, and the lower pointing triangle, the yoni, put together. So it's the feminine principle, the masculine principle, the heaven pointing to heaven, the pointing to earth. It's that overlaid on top of each other. It has a very sacred meaning in many traditions.
Similar to yin and yang.
Exactly. It is yin and yang. It's exactly yin and yang.
Yeah.
So then, well, after that, I wanted to also mention that the snowflakes are six-sided. I mean, how is that possible that every snowflake has 6 points to it? They all do. But there are some and very few, like the square, there are very few evidences of the 7-pointed, but there are some. And there's plant life that grows in sevens. So there is some heptagons and heptagrams.
Yeah, and which is, like you were saying, that the 5 is symbolic of the human limbs and head, and so the 7 could be said to be symbolic of angels, because it adds wings, to the limbs and things.
That's right. So they're often used in that way in various sacred structures, and so yes.
The apse of Chartres Cathedral actually uses a heptagram. That's how it lays out the end where the altar is.
Now the octagon is a shape that often, I think it's powerful. It's a powerful shape. Probably the most famous octagonal architecture would be the Dome of the Rock, I would say.
I suppose so. But the Muslims and Islamic architecture, they use the octagon. in the Alhambra.
In the Alhambra.
They had octagons everywhere.
Well,
you know, and that was an amazing experience of sacred geometry, just being surrounded by incredible kind of forms that had been handcrafted, and remember all of the ornamentation and everything. And
oh my God. It was so extraordinary. You had to feel that aliens had to have come down with lasers and created them that perfect and that exquisite, and the
tile
entire
work. Yeah.
The entire area of Alhambra has been sort of redone by numerous religions and actually secular. It started secular, and it was a palace too, at the Alhambra.
Well, it's like a tourist spot now.
Yes.
And
National site.
And we toured there with this world famous, probably the world's greatest sacred geometer to my knowledge, Keith Critchlow, who was an architect, but he studied the ancient kinds of ways of making buildings, which was all dependent, like Chartres Cathedral, and like the temples of the various different world cultures. They're all dependent on an understanding of sacred geometry. So he brought that as an architect back and taught it at the Prince's Academy in Wales. And Keith had a really great way of breaking it down. So he said, like we were saying, the circle is the symbol of spirit. The square is the symbol of matter. So we live in this world where the heaven of spirit and the earth of matter, it's like heaven and earth are represented by these two forms unconsciously. And we have something to bring them together. That's the triangle, the mind. So you have basically body, mind, spirit in three shapes. Now, look at churches, and you see what he's talking about. You've got the square, and a lot of churches or sacred places do an arch. Now, what is that? So an arch becomes like a square, that's the world, matter, connecting with the dome of heaven, with spirit. So immediately we start to see, like, the reason that they have these domes and things like that is that they're trying to bring to mind or immerse the body within a sacred form of this sphere, you know. And so then you see the point of the triangle. So you see a shape like the Gothic arch.
Gothic arch,
The
exactly.
Gothic arch has got it all. So you've got the heaven in the arch of the circle, but then it's kind of pointing up in the center, and you've got the mind's influence on the spirit ascending. You've got this sense of ascension, you know, and so these forms that surround us are pregnant with unconscious influence and meaning. And it's why I think that you know, having a meeting in a place where there's a dome gives an entirely different feeling than going through into a place that's compressed with a squared off.
Or a steeple pointing to heaven.
Exactly.
I want to honor Keith Critchlow for another moment by saying that he just passed in April, just this past April. And we brought him to the U.S. to consult with us about our temple. And he was a brilliant, the greatest sacred geometer alive. And now he's gone. But he wrote many, many books, and he was committed to only being the architect for sacred spaces, including sacred hospitals, the Sai Baba Hospital and the Krishnamurti Center, and some great spiritual teachers commissioned him to design their temples. And I know he wanted to design ours too, but
he did the earliest designs.
The earliest designs.
He did the earliest designs for the chapel
Yes, he did.
in the meadow.
Yeah.
Well, it's great to see some of those shapes in the Sacred Mirrors room, because of course the doorway is that classic foundation, circle, and the upward point in the arch.
When it came to creating the doors of Entheon and the doors of CoSM in the city, you drew the figures with the Father Desiderius sacred geometry proportions overlaid on them.
These kinds of embedded sacred geometric forms are ways of thinking about bringing heaven to earth, basically. Ways of contemplating these shapes as we draw them, and about the meaning that is surrounding us in the petals of flowers and in the various kinds of ways that nature is speaking to us.
Mm-hmm. It seems to be a way to build a relationship with the essence of being, This sacred geometry, it seems like it sits at the bottom of everything.
The psychonauts out there would agree that we see the sacred geometric webs when we journey inside with psychedelics. And many people have reported elaborate ornamentation that appears very similar to the temples that we're familiar with the extraordinary tiling and interweaving of forms. And so the webs and geometries, spirals, and kind of vast horizons of geometries that we see there, I think are it means that we're deeply wired with these forms.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
Well, I am so delighted to have this. We have been speaking with David and Eloria. David and Eloria? They studied at the Prince's Academy of Traditional Arts that was founded, one of the founders was Keith Critchlow. And they were studying there for 2 years when they were evacuated because of COVID, and they made it home.
They graduated,
but they did graduate. It was right at the end toward their graduation, and we did a nice discussion with them and asked them to give us a drop on sacred geometry.
All right, now let's check out a clip from Alex and Allison's recent interview with David Heskin and Eloria Weaver.
Next, our church is a subject that is very part of your expertise. And so we thought maybe you would have a few things to say about sacred geometry and why is it important and why is it important to your work?
It's a really great question, and words will only attempt to do justice to an experience.
Keith Critchlow liked to call geometry the art of the ever true. And geometry is really a shared language among all humans because it is the language of nature. It emanates from nature itself, herself.
And that quote actually goes back to Plato and really sort of looking at perennial wisdom, geometry as an expression, a flowering of the ever true through all cultures and all times. A circle is a circle no matter where you experience it, just as a sphere is a sphere and in any dimension. So there's an ability to tap into something eternal that comes through all of us. So the universal is really expressed so succinctly through geometry. And I think what interested Keith Critchlow so much about geometry was just this point. And he went into studying Islamic geometry because as a culture, the ancient geometers in that tradition really explored it and drew it out more than we see in any other culture that we have current ties to. And it's not that it belongs to that culture, but it's that they expressed it and celebrated geometry. And the way I looked at Islamic geometry as we learned it, it was sort of like stop frame images of cymatics. When we see this sound vibration that sort of ripples through water or sand, you get these coherent, beautiful imagery. I feel like and looking at Allyson, your work in the background, I see that this is sort of this cymatic coherence. We see coherence, and we reflect that and we relate to it, and it makes us feel whole to be in front of works like that. And I think that was really just something that this culture explored more than any other that we can point to, while still acknowledging geometry doesn't belong to any of us, just like the earth doesn't belong to us. Of course, we belong to it. So geometry is really this ideal language. We don't see it perfectly in a flower. We don't see a perfect pentagon, but we see the real striving toward this geometric ideal. And Keith was really fascinated by
The geometry of flowers.
the geometry of flowers and nature. And, he wrote a fantastic large book on that. And it's, in a way, so simple to connect to nature and to this ideal spiritual realm if we just acknowledge the patterns. And same, permaculture is acknowledging patterns as well. The work that's happening on your land is really doing all of this.
Well, the interesting thing about geometry, if I can get into the metaphoric levels of it a little bit, is that all geometry, no matter how complex, really boils down to a circle and a straight line. And every geometric construction, no matter how complex, from the simplest forms, like the flower of life that the visionary community is so familiar with, to the massively complex and ornate constructions that the Islamic geometers came up with. It's all just a compass and a straight edge. And that is the perfect metaphor for the intersection of the human and the divine realms. We've got the material plane represented by the straight line, and the divine realm, wholeness and unity, represented by the circle with its point at the center. And those metaphors just continue to unfold and expand, and they're very multi-layered. And so in every level of a geometric construction, as a geometer is practicing this art form, we can align our consciousness with those metaphors and understand that what we're doing is happening inside of us as well as outside of us.
Thank you, David and Aloria. That again was a sneak peek to Alex and Allyson's interview with them, which will be released on CoSM.tv in the coming week. Something that really stood out to me with what they said was what David said about cymatics and how sacred geometry is almost like a snapshot of a moment. And of course, cymatics is the study of how sound interacts with matter. You know, many people have seen the viral videos of sand on top of a speaker, that when you play a certain frequency, the sand self-organizes into different mandalic structures. And to me, that's so fascinating because it just shows that not only are these patterns almost like emergent of the laws of physics, but they also correlate with certain vibrations, you know? And I'm wondering, like, what is the sound of a circle? What is the sound of a square? Do these correlate to the certain primordial sounds like ah and om? I wonder.
Well, of course, you know, in yoga, you would intone certain tones that would be resonant with elements as well. And like Ram is like the fire and the solar. So in the solar plexus, you know, you have Ram. And so you can build those shapes with your imagination, but you also, due to cymatics, any vibration that's going through your body is, because we're mostly water, I guess, is sending some vibration through this, through our bodies.
And even, you know, in the mystical experience, we have not quite cymatics, but it's kind of synesthesia. When we hear a certain sound, that might be translated in our mind's eye into a certain geometric shape. So that's another way how we could have sacred geometry correlate with a particular sound that we're experiencing.
Yeah.
And it's so fascinating.
It's completely fascinating. And on the micro level, you've got, you know, interlocking, you know, like we were saying, the carbon atoms all hexagonally packed together and things. So
Yeah.
it's
It's amazing that you can make shapes with sound. And if we knew how to correlate them and what they communicated, we might be able to speak with aliens.
Well, thank you again to David Heskin and Aloria Weaver. Now, Alex will teach us how to draw the CoSM Eye of Spirit.
Thank you, everyone, for being with us for CoSM Art Church. And now Alex is going to end the program with a few lines, relevant lines, from the Golden Notes in Art Psalms.
The geometry of beauty is written in the golden ratio, the sacred harmonic proportions existent in all living things. Perfect beauty is aligned with the cosmic order. And may any merit generated by our gathering here today be offered to the benefit and liberation of all beings. Yay. Happy Art Church.
Happy New Moon.